Good morning to all of you who are just joining us. We've just opened up the virtual room for this particular panel, and we're going to just start in a couple of seconds, but I want to make a few preliminary remarks, and then I will introduce our panelists. And we will go ahead and get started because we have a lot of really interesting topics to delve into, to cover. So I want to be mindful of the time, and we hope this will be a really very interesting and exciting session. Welcome to Peace Week, and there've been a really great series of sessions and panels on just a wide variety of topics related to peace building and conflict management of many different types. So I just need to make sure to get our last panelist on, and I need to enable her, and then otherwise we should be good to go. Okay, just a small technical detail. I had to make sure that all our panelists could actually be co-host and present their information. So again, welcome everybody. I'm Jeff Helsing. I'm the executive director of the Better Evidence Project here at the Carter School. I'm also a research associate professor. Prior to coming to the Carter School, I spent 23 years at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I was head of education and training. So a lot of the ground that we're going to cover this morning is an area that I've been particularly engaged with in different ways and in different parts of the world. But our focus this morning is really on how we can think about conflict issues from the perspective of both research, evidence, and what we can learn from the challenges that local peacemakers and local communities face on the ground. And so we'll have three presentations that are going to provide a perspective on Africa in particular, but three different ways in which local perspectives have been brought to bear on critical issues of security and resilience, climate change, and peace building. And so I think you'll find that these presentations will do two things. One is help us understand how we can more effectively draw from and learn from local data, local research, and local perspectives on these challenges. And then what it means for the broader peace building community in terms of what we can learn and how we can promote this type of research more effectively. So with that, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then we will go from each one in succession. If you have a question that occurs to you or a comment, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I will sort of keep track of those, and then we'll have a good amount of time at the end for questions, answers, reflections, and responses. Okay. So we're going to hear from four people, three of which are going to make presentations, and then the fourth will really provide a bit of perspective in a short kind of discussant role, if you will. So our first speaker will be Matthew Baer, and he is a recent PhD graduate of the Carter School, but he's also was a recipient of a grant by the Better Evidence Project to look at sort of security issues and resilience in two communities in one in Burkina Faso, one in Niger. And his project was called Safe Havens Amidst the Jihadist Storms: How Leaders Spare Some Regions from Terrorist Violence in the Sahel. And so he's going to talk a bit about sort of that research and his work there. He is an expert on the Sahel, and he is currently the interim manager of the Transforming the Mind for Peace lab here at the Carter School. Our second speaker will be Beza Tesfaye, and she's the Director of Research and Learning for Migration and Climate Change at Mercy Corps. Beza is also Senior Associate at the Project on Fragility and Mobility at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also am very happy to be able to say she is on the Better Evidence Project Advisory Committee and has been an important asset and resource for our work. She's going to be talking about research that she's recently done, and it's related to a paper as part of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's Center for Preventive Action. They just done a paper series on managing global disorder, and in November, you can't see it, but it's a great little monograph on climate change and conflict in the Sahel. So she's going to be talking about that work and the paper itself. And then our final two speakers will be Patrick Vink and Phong Pham, both of whom work at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Patrick is the research director there, and Phong is the director of the program on evaluation and implementation science. They are also both assistant professors at the Harvard Medical School and the School of Public Health there. So they bring both the scholarship and the practitioner hats, in which really all of our panelists are in many ways scholars and practitioners. And then finally, our discussant will be my colleague, Ziad Al-Ashkar, who is the graduate research associate for the Better Evidence Project. He's my partner on this particular project, and Ziad is just finishing his PhD at the Carter School. In fact, as soon as he finishes here, I think he's going to make a few final changes and submit the thesis tomorrow. But Ziad, his work has been focused on the impact of data and technology in the humanitarian sphere. So he brings a lot of expertise and analysis on the role of and the impact of data and how we learn from that and how we can strengthen sort of the local capacity for learning, but also how the field itself can more effectively learn from the kind of local efforts that we're going to be discussing today. So with that, let me turn the screen, as it were, over to Matt. As I said, anything you want to add, question, reflection, just put it in the chat. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the Better Evidence team again for inviting me to talk with you today and to share the findings of my research, my field research in the Sahel, more specifically in Niger and Burkina Faso. I'm going to talk not of my whole research because I have little time to present all the research, but I'm going to focus on the locally led conflict prevention and peace building initiative and share with you evidence that it works and that when we give voice to local people to tell us the story of their conflict and their efforts to resolve conflict, we learn much from that. I guess that not many of you are familiar with the Sahara Sahel region. This is an arid strip of land that lies just south of the Sahara Desert, and it covers countries from Senegal to Eritrea, as you can see here on the map. This is a region that is considered as one of the poorest in the world and also one of the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And as you can imagine, this region is one of where the population growth is one of the fastest in the world. The population has been multiplied by almost 5 from 1960 to our days. And yet the resources have not really changed much. So this has created more and more intense competition among the growing population for resources that are declining, especially land, water for humans and animals, but also other natural resources. The region is not very poor in itself. It has a good natural endowment, especially mineral resources that external actors are also competing for. In fact, this region has been conflict-ridden, and the conflicts in the region date back to the pre-colonial times. West Africa in general has been the home of powerful kingdoms and empires, and some of them have fought each other, have been rivals, and these rivalries have not completely died with colonization. And we are seeing the resurgence of some of these rivalries on an ethnic basis or along ethnic lines. West Africa is very Muslim, and in some countries, more than 90% of the population are Muslims. But fortunately for us, the Islam that is practiced in West Africa is generally moderate and tolerant. Unfortunately, since the Arab Spring, we have seen a resurgence of jihadist extremist Islam in some areas of West Africa, but also North Africa. And the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya in 2011 has opened the door to a resurgent extremist Islam, with some groups accessing the arsenals of Gaddafi. And Libya has become, as someone said, an open supermarket of arms. And people can easily access these arms and voice their grievances in a violent way. From 2012 to 2022, there were about 38,000 incidents recorded across the Sahara-Sahel region, with more than 11,000 fatalities and close to 3 million displaced people. Those are data from ACLED. Now, my study or my research has been inspired by reporting by a Reuters journalist in a village called Amatatal in Niger. And the article was titled, "Does this village hold the key to jihadists, to African jihad?" And after reading the article, I also remembered that in Burkina Faso, there is a locality that has been quite safe and spared itself from the jihadist storm that is sweeping across the Sahel. So I wanted to know more about these two localities and how they manage to preserve themselves from the violence and the jihadist storm in the region. So I asked myself, what were the specific strategies that political authorities, religious and local community leaders implemented to keep Dori and Amatatal relatively safe, and what we could learn from their practices. What concrete evidence can we gather from these two localities that show that local peace building or conflict prevention initiatives do work? Because we tend to sometimes look down on local wisdom and what local people have been trying to preserve peace in their communities. And we tend to think that they are just recipients of international development aid, humanitarian aid, and peace-building initiative. But in fact, when we listen to them, we get a better sense, a better understanding of what is going on on the ground. We get also a better understanding of the dynamics of local conflicts and some important details about the complex relationship between the groups involved in the conflict. My study has consisted in mainly in interviews and informal conversations. The interviews were with 36 local key informants. In fact, those are key actors that were involved in peace building, conflict prevention, or that work with the government, international organizations, and all of them have had some connections or some involvement in various initiatives in Amatatal, Agadez in Niger, but also in Dori in Burkina Faso. The research was conducted for about 4 months during the summer of 2011. And I collected a lot of data, not only during my stay there, but after I returned to the US. So this vast amount of data collected in French, in Tamashek, but also in local languages such as More and Fulfulde were translated into English and then imported, coded and analyzed with the support of NVivo. NVivo is a qualitative analysis software. As I said, the results have been quite interesting, but I cannot share all of them with you here. I'll focus on two key pieces of evidence that I got from this study. As I said earlier, when we give voice to local people, we get a better understanding of local conflict dynamics in the Sahel or other parts of the world. And this can help craft more contextualized and more effective responses to conflict, and also contribute with local people to promote more sustainable peace. And in fact, what I also realized from this study is that local people should be the primary actors and are better positioned to make peace. And when they own and lead the peace building initiative, they get better results sometimes than the costly international interventions. Let me just give you some empirical evidence and some data, based on some data that I extracted from ACLED. ACLED is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Database, and from the Global Terrorism Database. In Amatatal, the village that I studied in Niger, there was no terrorist or conflict incident, nor any fatality recorded until the end of June 2021, when I completed my field research there. And I checked back the data in 2022, and I realized that only 2 armed robbery incidents were signaled in Amatatal. This is a great exception in that violent region. And in Dori and its vicinities, Dori is the main city of the northern Sahel region in Burkina Faso that is most affected by terrorism, and not only in Africa, but now around the world. There were only 7 incidents recorded by the end of June 2021. And based on the criteria of what can be called terrorism, according to the Global Terrorism Database, only 1 of these incidents could be considered terrorist. So when you look at the data and the thousands of incidents and terrorist fatalities recorded in both countries and across the region, you wonder why these 2 localities have managed to preserve themselves. And yet they are located in very sensitive, violent regions. So the question is, why this resilience, this particular exceptional resilience to widespread regional violence and insecurity? So after analyzing the data, this is what I understood. The different actors that I talked with mentioned a number of initiatives or some factors specific to the region that help them preserve peace. Both in Dori and in Amatatal, they mention the activism, the involvement of local actors. This peace activism took several forms. For example, in Amatatal, the commitment of former rebels to peace. They were not prosecuted. Some of them benefited from an amnesty law policy from the government, and they became the primary actors of peace building in the region. In Dori, there is an NGO called the Union of Fraternal Believers that help Christians and Muslims come together in various kinds of fora to work together for community development, for tolerance and interreligious dialogue. And this organization and several others help to maintain a general climate of tolerance in the region. So the jihadist group, when they emerged, found it very difficult to enter and settle in these regions because their ideology was rejected. They couldn't recruit any young people despite various offers that they made. And as a result, they couldn't operate in these localities, both in Amatatal and Dori. But in both localities, I was also told that there were some initiatives that were taken by the government that help preserve peace. Those were initiatives that facilitated political and economic inclusion of minorities, but also of the youth. For instance, a lot of efforts was done to create job opportunities, vocational training opportunities for the youth. And as someone said, when the youth are kept busy and they are satisfied with their lives, they don't see any point in joining an armed insurgency group or a gang or get involved in transnational illicit activities like drug trafficking or illicit immigration towards Europe. So you can see here on these graphs the different factors highlighted in my conversation with the local actors about what helped them preserve peace. More detail can be seen in my report. But now, they also mention a few factors that have been impediments to the success of the peace building and conflict resolution efforts. I'll just mention 3 of them here. And some of us practitioners often heard that, especially in Africa. What they realize is that international actors do not trust much local peace building wisdom and local peace building efforts. So there is little financial and logistical support offered to local actors who try to build peace. And another important obstacle that they mentioned to the success of their efforts is insecurity and the fact that local peace builders do not feel protected. And when they don't feel protected, it's very difficult to operate in regions that are plagued by insecurity, very difficult for them to collaborate with government security forces or other actors who work for peace and security in the region. So let me finish with just a few takeaways from my study. Both in Niger and Burkina Faso, I heard repeatedly that local peace committees are a key instrument that can help maintain peace. And there are some studies that mention the same thing in other countries of Africa. Another takeaway is that peace building, peace activism, and peace education efforts by reliable local leaders is sometimes more effective than costly interventions taken by external actors, because these local leaders know their people better, they know their problems, and they stay there and they can continue the effort even when there is no more funding. Another takeaway is the key role that former combatants can play in post-conflict peace building. We tend sometimes to look negatively at former combatants, and we don't see any other way of interacting with them than taking them to court. But the case of Amatal shows that when former combatants are treated with more compassion and in a more friendly way, and when they are involved in peace building and development efforts, they can really help stabilize a whole region, as it happened in the case of Agadez. Lastly, income generating activities play a huge role in keeping the youth involved, engaged, and peaceful. When people are given the opportunity to earn their living, to be happy, and they are satisfied with their life, they don't see any reason to turning to armed rebellion, to extremist movements, or to illegal activities, or even to migrate to other parts of the world. Finally, I should say that at the structural level, governments and the international community do have a key role to play. And much effort, both by locals and international actors, should be placed on improving governance, especially through measures that facilitate political and economic inclusion of marginalized groups like the Tuareg or the Fulani. Instead of investing much money, billions of dollars in military interventions with the hopes of neutralizing more and more perpetrators of terrorism and illicit activities, I think that part of this money would do more good and yield better results if it is invested in supporting local peace building and conflict prevention efforts. So you will find my full report here if you click this link. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. We'll now turn to Beza, who will focus on the same region, but a significantly different focus area, climate change. So Beza, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just share my screen. I also have a presentation.
Great.
Is everyone seeing this?
Yes.
Okay, great. As Jeff mentioned, the focus of my work is looking at macro trends in the Sahel, and particularly climate change and how it might impact instability and conflict. As Jeff mentioned, I did this paper on behalf of the Council for Foreign Relations, but more importantly, my background is in humanitarian, in the humanitarian sector and a bit in development as well. So just saying that because my ideas are very much shaped by these experiences in humanitarian and development work, more so than a security focus, which is often what we hear when we think about the Sahel. So just to clarify upfront what my research objectives were for this discussion paper. Oops. Sorry. All right, sorry, I dropped my phone. So first and foremost, it was really trying to take stock of the context. So I tried to unpack a bit the environmental, the socioeconomic, and the political context in the Sahel. And as I think Matthew has already described it, the Sahel technically is a zone that is defined by its climate, really, and it spans across Africa, from West Africa to East Africa, all the way to Eritrea. But I tried to define the Sahel a bit more narrowly for my research. So I was focused mostly on what we refer to as the Western Sahel, and particularly the six Francophone countries in this part of West Africa: Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Chad, and Senegal. And very much when we think about instability, I really focused on Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The second objective was to then look at some of the emerging risks and challenges in the region that could contribute to further instability, given these environmental, socioeconomic, and political realities. And the two key risk factors that I looked at was first climate change, and then also the issue of demographic changes in the region, or population growth, as Matthew has mentioned. And then the last part of the paper was more sort of forward-looking and thinking about policies and types of responses, particularly from the international community, that could help to mitigate some of these challenges and risks. So I like to share my conclusions up front. So these are the main things that I argued in the paper, the discussion paper. The first is that if we really examine conflicts in the Sahel, I think they can primarily be viewed as an outcome of socioeconomic vulnerabilities, as well as political challenges, particularly weak and ineffective governance institutions and responses in the region. Secondly, there's this sort of feedback loop where the insecurity in this part of the world further undermines governance, because in those places where there's lack of security, the government is less able to engage with local populations, and then there becomes this sort of void in the presence of the government. And again, you see this feedback loop that leads to what some refer to as a crisis of legitimacy. And then the third point is that when we look at this context, the added effect of climate change can be really detrimental. And what climate change means practically is what we're seeing, which is increasing temperature, as well as changes in rainfall patterns that are mostly manifested in more intense and frequent rainfall. So this macro trend, alongside things like population growth and also the broader, instability, poor governance issues, can lead to negative impacts on things like livelihoods, health, and change even patterns of mobility in the region. And finally, absent, investments and ways to redress these challenges, particularly the need for adaptation and conflict prevention, then there is a risk that there could be an increase in violence in the region. So very quickly, just zooming out, I think, in any conversation about climate change, it's important to kind of frame it in terms of sort of the global challenge. And I think what is very striking about our, the notion of climate change as a global issue is that when we look at both who is responsible and who is affected by climate change, it is not evenly distributed. So this is looking at global emissions by region. And what you will see here, which is not surprising, the industrialized countries and regions are primarily responsible for the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And if you look at Africa, which is again the region that we're focused on, the contribution of this continent to the problem is really, really insignificant. But when we look at who is impacted, so this is a map of vulnerability to climate change based on data from Notre Dame's GAIN Index, which looks at climate vulnerability. It ranks countries in terms of climate vulnerability. You'll see the countries that are in red or orange are the ones that are mostly affected or most vulnerable. And here I've circled the Sahel region that I was focused on, and you'll see again really a very vulnerable part of the world in terms of climate vulnerability and lack of adaptive capacity. So in terms of the environmental trends in the Sahel, one of the trends that we have been seeing over the past century or so is that there has been gradually increasing average temperatures, which, as we all know, scientists have linked this phenomena to climate change or the issue of global warming. And what is striking is that this increase in average temperatures in the Sahel is a greater increase than what we're seeing globally. So I think the global average that we've seen in this time period is about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. But when we look at the Sahel, the increase has been larger than that. And some predict that the trend could see temperatures increasing up to 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in the next 50 years or so. The second trend in terms of climate change and its impacts in the region has to do, as I mentioned, with variation in rainfall. And here is a graph of rainfall anomalies, so any kind of variation from the mean in the Sahel. And what you will notice is that it is not unusual to see this type of variation in the region. In fact, there have been periods of great variation in terms of lack of rain or greater than average rain, particularly in the 1960s or so, 1970s and onward, the Great Sahelian Drought. So it's not unusual. But what is predicted for the future is increasing level of uncertainty around rainfall patterns and a trend of more intense rainfall events, similar to what we saw in 2020, for example, where there were significant floods that occurred in places like Niamey and Niger and other parts. So intensity in rainfall is just something that is of concern. It's a concern because it can lead not only to drought or flooding on the two extremes, but also because any type of variability in rainfall patterns has significant impacts on rain-fed agriculture, because predictability is really important for farmers to plan how they will sort of manage their production of crops. So why climate change is particularly challenging for the Sahel is because livelihoods primarily depend on natural resources. So about 80% of livelihoods in the region are related to agriculture, farming, pastoralism, and fishing. And as I've mentioned, you know, things like agriculture and pastoralism can be significantly affected by variations in weather patterns, which is what is predicted for the future. I think it's also noteworthy that livelihood groups in the Sahel, as in much of sub-Saharan Africa, intersect with ethnic identities. So you have certain groups, like for example, the Tuareg, that are traditionally associated with nomadic pastoralism, and you have other groups that are associated with farming. So these sort of distinctions as well sort of overlap with vulnerabilities to climate change. And we have heard a lot about increasing incidences of clashes between different livelihood groups, which also then translate to clashes between different ethnic groups. And I think this is again a troubling kind of reality of the pressures that climate change is putting on livelihoods. Another thing that's very noteworthy about the Sahel is that there's a lot of mobility, a lot of movement. This is just looking at transhumans, so it's the movement of pastoralists and their herds. There's a lot of internal movement, but also a lot of transboundary movement. Typically, you see pastoralists moving from the north to the southern part of the Sahel during dry seasons, and then back north during wet season. So there's this constant mobility across the region, which leads to complications, I would say. But at the same time, countries have developed agreements that help to manage this transboundary movement of people and their herds. Now, one thing that has led to tensions, I would say, between different livelihood groups, particularly between pastoralists and farmers, is this phenomena that we're seeing not just in the Sahel, but across West Africa, which is of agricultural expansion. So this is just a map that depicts the sort of the extent of that across the region. And this is another one as well. I won't talk about this in detail, but essentially it's showing that over the past few decades, we are seeing an increase in terms of land being used for agriculture, cropland, at the expense of land that is traditionally used by pastoralists, savanna, grassland, for grazing their animals. And this change has led to tensions between groups, particularly in the context of things like weak governance, weak land tenure, and particularly amongst pastoralist groups like the Fulani, like the Tuareg, who oftentimes see themselves as, you know, the losers in this dynamic, and who become increasingly marginalized. And I bring this up because if you read about the dynamics around jihadism, jihadist violence in the Sahel, it's quite striking that a lot of the groups that tend to be recruited into violent extremism are from these marginalized pastoralist groups that have lost land and access to resources over the decades. My research looked at migration a little bit. I'm going to go through this fast because of time, but I wanted to look at migration because it's often something that people in the international community, Western policymakers, talk a lot about with regards to Africa and the Sahel. There is this notion that, you know, people are leaving in mass numbers and going to Europe. This is a bit deceptive, I would say. You know, when we look at the big flow of migrants to Europe, particularly around 2015 through 2017, that flow was primarily from war-torn countries like Syria and Afghanistan. So in this graph, you'll see that in the far left, the Western Balkan route, which is from Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, the flows are much higher than what you actually see from Central Mediterranean routes up on the top. So just to say, I think this notion of mass exodus from the Sahel is deceptive. And when we look at actual migration flows here, you'll see that most of the movement in terms of migration in the region remains within the region. There's a lot of regional migration, cross-border migration, with the exception of maybe one or two countries, Senegal, where there is, for example, a large diaspora in France and other, you know, other countries, and Nigeria, but I didn't really count Nigeria as part of the Sahel, but overall, most of the migration remains in the region. Yeah, so I also looked at population growth in this context because I think it's a very important trend. Matthew also referred to this. The population has really picked up in the past few years. You can see that the birth rates, population growth rates in places across the Sahel are really high. Niger, I think, holds the record or is amongst the highest in the world. This means that the population in these countries is quite young and will continue to be young. And, you know, this raises concerns for some researchers, for some policymakers, but it can also be a potential asset, just kind of depending on policies in place to support this type of increase in the labor force, particularly. Just a couple more slides. So I, of course, wanted to also look at the security crisis and the conflicts in the region. I think Matthew has also done a very good job describing this. There's a timeline here on the left, and maybe the main thing to point out is that a lot of the violence that we see is really emanating from one country in particular, Mali, where there was a coup d'etat, there was a sort of an insurgency in the north by Tuareg, the Tuareg coalition. And there was also a spillover of violence from other places, particularly from Libya and groups from Algeria. So it's a very complex situation. There was a significant intervention by particularly the French, which led to some level of stabilization, and then a peace agreement was signed in 2015. But if you look to the right, despite that progress, the conflict has exacerbated and has actually expanded to other countries significantly since 2015. So now you see even more violence in Mali, but also significantly in Burkina Faso and in Niger over the past few years. And this is the situation recently. Essentially, you have large parts of Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso that are effectively controlled by groups that are affiliated either with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, and a lot of insecurity and a lot of challenges. But you also have a large intervention, a large sort of external intervention, military intervention from various actors. The French, Canadians have also been involved. There's the G5 Sahel, which is a regional body. Americans have been involved. There are quite a lot of actors that are militarily engaged in this region, and yet we don't see the violence kind of dissipating. I think this is a very interesting and important question as to why this insurgency has sustained itself and expanded at the same time that there's been this intervention. I think many of us would say because this approach has not been effective. One reason why it hasn't been effective is because the impact of this military intervention, the counterterrorism intervention, has been really felt by the civilian population. So in this graph, which is from ACLED, you'll see that the civilian casualties caused by security forces is actually higher than either casualties by jihadist or extremist groups or militias. So there's been a lot of human rights violations and a lack of accountability for that by the defense forces, which perpetuates this sense of marginalization and might further, sustain this insurgency. So my last slide, in my paper, I presented some policy recommendations, mostly focused on the international community and how to rethink their engagement in the Sahel. So this is the categories of my recommendations. One around refocusing in terms of security and prioritizing the human security needs that have been already discussed. I think there's a need for investment in climate adaptation for the region, as this challenge is going to be increasingly significant. And then also, supporting sort of the local adaptation and peace building actors on the ground, as Matthew mentioned, who have the ability to make more of an impact in supporting peace and resilience. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beza. And I think we certainly are seeing some really interesting links around the issue of security. And that leads us now to our last presentation, which will be focused a little bit further south, but also will create sort of the connections to security as well. So, Patrick, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the fascinating presentations and in-depth look at some of the challenge in the Sahel. Indeed, this presentation is a little bit different, you know, we'll talk about measurement. We'll talk about assessing and understanding what does peace, what are we building when we build peace, and how do we measure it? And so I took this picture, a famous sculpture, you know, on the knotted gun, because it really brings and memorializes this idea of nonviolence and the absence of violence as a key outcome of interest. But really, when you talk with communities, you know that peace is more than that. And so what we did with this work is really try to, again, understand simple questions, what may appear like simple questions, like what does peace mean to you? How can peace be achieved in your opinion? And these are questions that we've been asking ourselves since, you know, for 20 years now. And really at the time, I think it has changed now, but at the time, this was not done. You had big questions. We were confronted with big questions in Rwanda, in the DRC, in northern Uganda, as to what was happening. And I think Fong and I were somewhat uneasy at to understanding what was happening. And we came up with that simple idea: let's just ask people. And I will say that I'm talking, I'll be the one presenting, but I'm very much talking on behalf of a much larger team in the Congo, in the Central African Republic, where we've done a lot of work, again, trying to use participatory methods, mixed methods, to start understanding how do we unpack these complex processes and how do we assess people's perception, people's attitudes, people's knowledge on issues related to peace. And this is work, as I mentioned, so that builds on a broader set of work we've done for almost 20 years, including almost 10 years in the DRC and a little less in the Central African Republic, conducting those peace, justice, and security surveys. I like to compare them when you think of health. You know that every country, not every country, but many countries around the world implement, for example, what is called the demographic and health survey. That is a snapshot of what is the health status today. And yet when it comes to peace building, we don't have that. What is the snapshot of peace in our country? Not broad indicators and nationwide comparison, but within the country, what is the status? How are we progressing towards peace? Not, is my project building on women's rights functioning? That's great, it's important. Is my project on livelihood for youth working? That's great, that's important. But together, do these projects help build a more peaceful society? And so we were very fortunate, and I'd like to thank the Better Evidence Project here to receive some of the support to continue our thinking through those measures and indicators, and very much in this context, engage with local NGOs, local peace builders, local organizations contributing to building peace, to understand what do they measure, how do they assess peace building, its effectiveness. And so we were able to implement some field research in both countries with key informant interviews and focus groups in both countries. Now, I'll talk about indicators and measure at 3 levels, and I'm not going to spend too much time on these global measures. I think many of us know them. And again, the commonly accepted definition from Galtung, the negative peace, this absence of violence, but then also a more positive peace, that is aspects that deals with fragility, with human development, with security, with, you know, everything that is beyond the absence of violence. And so you have very interesting measures that have been developed. Some of them are direct measures, that is, they are directly proposing to measure peace. And then some measures are indirect in the sense that they don't necessarily claim to measure peace, but clearly peace exists when those measures are positive. So when we talk about state fragility, when we talk about, well, a lot of those, but even the Human Development Index, fundamentally, you can think of that as a peace measure. That is, if human development is achieved, then peace should be achieved. And in fact, we see from the two previous presenters some of those links at the very global level. And yet, when we think about these measures, clearly they lack context. Clearly, it doesn't necessarily reflect what communities, what actors on the ground think of when they are thinking about peace. And I'll go into that in discussion in a minute. But I took a seminar on how to write slides, and I was told never to put full sentences. So I didn't put any sentence, but I put a lot of words in this case. But what this concept map is about is the result of our consultation with national and local NGOs, peace building organization, and it's really mapping their indicators. So we had discussion with them, we looked at all the reports, information that we had as to what are they measuring. And this is a synthesis from both countries. I'll highlight some difference. I'm not going to go through everything, but what was key is that there were strong measures in two key dynamic: social cohesion, where you had practical measures of coexistence. That is, do communities coexist? Do they live in the same place? But also in the workplace, for example, or in other activities. And then you had more or less tangible notions and very differently defined necessarily as to what it means to live in harmony. What does it mean to belong together? What does it mean to be empowered in society? But a number of indicators dealing with social cohesion. None of this should be surprising, but we'll go into some of the discussion in a minute and where the local aspect drives some of the discussion and interest that we have. And then there were a major set of indicators, of course, dealing with security, dealing specifically with the presence or absence of violence, as I just mentioned, dealing with the presence of security actors, for example. We were somewhat surprised to see very few measures or discussion of indicators of peace as relating to justice and conflict resolution. And to some extent on governance and resource, we just talked about the importance of the economy, of employment, of jobs, but also access to service, state presence. So these were less present in the discussion, but they were still important. Now, across countries, we see some differences. For example, when you think of security in the DRC, most of the local actors were very much focused on what I would call the outcome. That is, number of events of violence, very tangible, very objective measures of presence or absence of violence. In the Central African Republic, we had a little bit more concerns about trends. Is the situation improving? We had aspects of fear, so a little bit more oriented towards dynamics. What is happening? Are people mobilizing? Are people demobilizing towards violence? So a little bit dynamic and a qualitative difference. Another difference, for example, when you look at justice and conflict resolution, in both countries, measures were very much focused on objective measures. That is, what mechanism do you use? How effective are those mechanisms? But one key difference is that in the DRC, they were much more focused on community level type of conflict resolution mechanism, as opposed to in the Central African Republic, where there was a lot more focus on formal justice. So we see qualitative difference. We start mapping, again, concept. None of these concepts should be very surprising, but there are, in fact, interesting difference. So let's just let me give you one example. When you look at the global level, when you look at ACLED data that was just mentioned, you typically are focused on large-scale forms of violence related to armed groups, for example. But when we talk to people and the measures, the NGOs, they are really much more concerned by day-to-day security. They are much more concerned by robberies, by small events that create this insecurity. And in fact, this really explains, in our opinion, why we consistently find over time that perception of security is not related to exposure or proximity to violence by armed groups. That is, there are other factors that come into play, and these include those day-to-day type of security concern, but also the perception of security actors. Now, I mentioned these a little bit, but what we try to do with this concept now, the words are not written completely randomly. It's not perfect, but we try to represent that there is also a differences between subjective measures and objective measures. And it was really interesting in our analysis to find that when it comes to security, for example, these organizations were very much focused on objective measures. Again, how many crimes have occurred, how many incidents of violence, presence of weapons. So very objective measures as to what is happening. I mean, objective in the sense that these are tangible, people may still misreport, but they are objective measures. Whereas when it came to social cohesion, for example, we had much more focus on subjective measures. Do you feel like you belong in your community? Do you experience a sense of harmony in your community? These are much less tangible and harder to interpret to some extent, but they're also very context specific as to what does it mean? How do you express solidarity? And what was fascinating about the discussion of the Sahel is I know from experience there is that the way you express solidarity in the Sahel is very different from what you express in the DRC. In fact, you don't even have to go that far. If you look at Rwanda and the Congo, the daily instance, the daily demonstration of solidarity can be very different in terms of, for example, the importance of sharing a drink together. In some places it matters, in other places it actually doesn't have much meaning. And so depending on where you are, these manifestation of social cohesion can be very different, which means you should be measuring them in a different manner. Another aspect I mentioned a little bit is this aspect of some measures of effects and impact, but mostly measures of process and performance. So not necessarily, okay, so we know to give you an example, when it comes to justice and conflict resolution, there is a sense as to what mechanism do you have access to? How do you rank your access to these mechanisms? How satisfied are you with how these mechanisms work? But it doesn't necessarily translate into, okay, what's the impact? What's the effect of the presence of these mechanisms? What does it make for you? How does it change the peace aspect in society? So again, it was really interesting for us to map these indicators. We find some very different conception, very different approach to some of the global measures, but we also examine this in comparison to the work that we have done with communities and consulted, including in the case of, in the context of this project, where we again start all of our research with very qualitative phases, where we ask, what does peace mean to you? How is it achieved? Who should be responsible? Can you define what it means to be in a peaceful state, for example? And the range of responses that we get to this question have led us to redevelop kind of these 6 broad categories. I'm not going to detail all the framework here, but of course we talk about social cohesion, and that's a strong matching to what we heard from the local organization. Justice and security indicators are important. But again, we were surprised to maybe find a little less about legacy of the past. How do you deal with the past violence? What has been done? Do you know what has happened? Why has it happened? How do you deal with justice at that level? These were not things that we found in local NGOs assessments, and yet at the community level, people express these to be important. And I guess the point here is to show that the reality is nobody has a universal truth. The global actors measure things one way, the local NGOs measure things one way, and the community express things in a different way. And it's not like necessarily one is superior to the other, but it should really be seen as complementary, as completing and trying to build a cohesive picture from these different measures and assessment is key to understanding what is happening in terms of peace. And let me give you one example, a very simple example here. So in the DRC, we've done over 100,000 interviews over the years, but this is at midpoint in our research. again, standard question, how safe do you feel in different situations, people's perception of security, which again is not necessarily related to the absence of violence. We find that when violence is absent, people can still feel unsafe. And at the same time, violence may occur and then still people are safe, because what people define as security is different. And when we ask what are those causes, we of course see the presence of bandits, the presence of armed group, but the economy, the poverty was a major concern driving the sense of insecurity. And when we ask, well, how do you measure that? What are some of the questions you have? Well, people talk about satisfaction with their occupation. And we find that 85% of working youth, for example, are not happy with their livelihood, are not happy with their occupation. It very much echoes what Beza was mentioning in her work in the Sahel. We find the importance of these indicators. We find that very few people are satisfied with their opportunities to find work. And the worst score when it comes to government performance is not how well is the government doing in terms of building peace, how well is the government doing in terms of social cohesion, is the worst score was how satisfied are you with the government efforts to create employment. And yet that is a core concern for people, and that contributes to this sense of insecurity. But we would not know necessarily this if we adopted global framework on assessing peace. And the reality, and these are some of the comments, is that what local organization measures tend to be very much influenced in response to top-down demand for accountability, so that frameworks are not truly local to some extent. They are largely influenced by what donors want, by what international partners want. And so one of the lessons learned is we really need to let local organizations engage with local communities and define their own approach to measuring the effectiveness of peace building. I mentioned the aspect of what violence counts. We tend to focus to large-scale armed group forms of violence, and yet when we talk about security and day-to-day sense of safety, what matters is not those instances of violence, it's really the day-to-day harassment, the day-to-day constraints. Now we have another set of lessons learned or insight from our work, which is one, the importance of being able to provide real-time measures, to be able to provide information as it happens and relate and inform projects as they are being rolled out in the country. And that's not simple to do. Technology helps, but it's also really about building mechanisms that enable that type of dynamic reporting. Importantly, in the discussion with organizations, we didn't necessarily anticipate this, but in our interviews, what really came was the importance of data as intervention. That is, it's not just an accountability, not just a measure, but it is about being able to establish a diagnostic and then use that information for advocacy. Use that information to engage with communities. Hey, we did a research here when we found that this percentage of people feel unsatisfied with their livelihood. What can we do about this? And so data becomes not just measure, doesn't become just a normative or an accountability aspect, but an intervention in itself. And that really leads to create what we call policy spaces, what we call opportunity to create dialogue, opportunities to create negotiation even around data points that are fairly objective, data points that, this is what we found. We don't have an advocacy message, but this is what we found. What are we going to do about it? Finally, a number of local organizations told us that what really mattered to them or what was important and that is not captured is the existence of networks. How do these peace builders relate to each other? Are they all dependent to international organizations? Do they collaborate with each other? And they found this as important both for their own existence, for their resilience. Can they continue to survive through their collaboration when funding dries out, for example? And yet again, that connectedness of actors is not something that we necessarily measure. And I will say that on the side of our work that deals with natural disaster, we see that it's really, really important to build that kind of understanding of networks, because if everyone depends on international actors, then the day those international actors leave, you don't have that resilience, you don't have that ability to continue functioning. And so again, that was an insight that came from this work. I'm not going to elaborate on the last slide. I think that many of these aspects have been mentioned, the importance of local ownership, the sustainability that comes with these approach, but I will emphasize again the fact that it's not just about measuring, but it's about what do we do with those measures and how can we use this information to advance advocacy messages, to improve measures and responses. And that's where local organizations felt both the importance of the work that they are doing, but also the limits of their ability to engage and influence what international actors are doing. I warned you this was a slightly different angle and perspective, but I think it's really matched and builds on what my colleagues have been talking about, and I look forward to your question and feedback. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Patrick. And boy, I just started writing down all kinds of interesting connections and different ways in which all three have really, I think, expanded how we need to think about conflict in local assessments. So I'm going to leave it to Ziad to take a couple of minutes just with some reflections based on what we've heard, and then we'll open up to as many questions as we can get in. If you have a question, again, just put it in the chat as well. So Ziad.
Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize, but I think one of the key takeaways that I got from Mathieu and Beza and Patrick and Fong's work is that we as researchers and academics and people who are in the practice world need to be more thoughtful about how we think about engagement with local communities and our role in this space. I think the three presentations highlighted kind of the importance of less kind of internationally driven approaches to peace building, but also being aware that the local level initiatives and local level community levels that the local levels and local approaches are also complex. I think one of the things that we tend to think about as academics is that we have this kind of dialectic between international and local, but I think on the local level, and I think Patrick's and Fong's work show that there is a diversity and kind of also a complexity of how we think about some of the issues. I think the notion of peace and how we think about peace and how we measure it has been an area that's underexplored, and I think this is work that needs to be done more on how we think about that. I wrote a lot, but I'm going to kind of stay simple. I think the three presentations did a great job of also articulating that we need to understand the role of local governance, I think, and local dynamics as they relate to peace and conflict a lot more than just thinking about issues from a national or regional perspective. Of course, they play a role, but I think the local approaches and the day-to-day is oftentimes where the violence happens and where the peace is built. And so I think as the Better Evidence Project, our goal is also to pay attention to how we think about local peace on a community level and the day-to-day peace and approaches that actually work versus, as Matt pointed out, costly international interventions and Beza's work, deadly international interventions at times. So how do we spend our efforts and limited resources and funds as a peace building community to support local actors is going to be key. That's all. I'll wrap up my 2 minutes.
Thanks, Ziad. I will take a first shot at a question, and then if anybody else has questions, please raise your virtual hands or put it in the chat. My question is really to all three of you very quickly. Security was clearly an important, not only theme, but such a critical condition in all three of your presentations, but in different ways. And I'm wondering, in terms of just what Patrick and Fong have done, is sort of help us understand sort of the different definitions and perceptions of security. And I'm wondering if each of you could talk about how, whether it's climate change or resistance to recruitment, or the, how security emerges, whether it's from economic insecurity, climate change, local recruiting dynamics, et cetera. Is it that we need to kind of think about security as a through line throughout so much of the human experience in these local communities? Or are we oversimplifying the security through lines, and we really do need to kind of not exclude, but separate security from real climate issues, real agricultural issues, real sort of extremist issues? So I hope that question makes sense, and I'd love for a response from each of you.
Maybe,
Hey.
oh, sorry, Beza.
No, please go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I think security from a psychological perspective, so, psychologically, security is a basic desire. It's a basic need for us. Like, all of us want to feel safe somehow, economically, physically, and psychologically, right? And I think it is, so I think since it's so fundamental, I can see why it pervades through and cross-cut across all of the themes. And until we get that sense of security, we can't physically like go out and do our day-to-day things, right? Or we don't want to leave the house. And we can think about during COVID, what happens when we felt unsecure, right? Everything shut down and everything like that. I think if we can think of it that way, to make people feel safe so that it enabled them to, go out and make a living, get what they need to sustain themselves and developed. I think if we don't provide that basics, then I think other hierarchy of needs can't be achieved. So I think of it more as a fundamental human need.
Thank you. Yeah, Beza.
Yeah, I more just wanted to say I really enjoyed both of the presentations, and I think it also is very aligned with how I was thinking about security in these conversations around climate change. Oftentimes there's a tendency to sort of connect this to like hard security, and that in some ways has mobilized like interest and investments from different international actors to think about the implications of climate change on things like access to energy and the potential for the spillover of conflict. But in places like the Sahel, what was very clear to me is that this is really a human security issue, and human security meaning people lack access to basic to fulfill their basic needs. So access to food security is a challenge, water security is a challenge, access to healthcare, education, just these challenges, as I mentioned upfront in my presentation, are primarily driven by the socioeconomic vulnerabilities that people feel, and then the lack of effective governance to actually meet those needs. So I think it's very important to understand and recognize that. And the lack of recognition of that has led to a very militarized response by governments in the region as well as international actors. And we've seen how that has been ineffective. So it's really important to highlight this human security aspect in the climate discussions.
Oh, great point. Thank you. Yeah, Patrick, I see your hand up.
I don't want to preempt. I know Mathieu was going to talk as well.
No, go ahead. I'll
Okay.
talk last.
I just wanted to add. I think what's interesting about insecurity and peace building is it does have these numerous connection pathways as to how insecurity undermines or affects the ability to be effective at building peace. There are mechanisms that go through the social cohesion angle. That is, if you're afraid of your neighbor, if you fear engaging, then how really can you build peace? And then we have those dealing with access to resources that Beza just highlighted. I just wanted to again emphasize what Fong was mentioning. In climate change, for example, what is emerging is a consensus about the existence and the issue of eco-anxiety. That is, climate change is creating anxiety, but the reality is there's well-documented pathway that leads from anxiety to violence. And so, those numerous pathways are there, and I think we need to better identify them to understand how to achieve or address them. And when it comes to climate change, I think this importance of communicating and making people aware of climate change and prepare and adapt, but at the same time addressing the risk of eco-anxiety is critical. And I don't see, for example, this is an area where peace building could do more, in my opinion. Over to you.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think you are right, Jeff. Security is like the connecting point to all the concerns and issues that you raised. And I think Beza is right to say that human security should be seen in a holistic way as human security. And when I try to examine more closely the various initiatives and interventions that were taken by local actors and the definitions of peace, I realize that in fact for them, security is not just limited to absence of violence or conflict, not being aggressed. It's not just that. It's much more than that. For instance, when a cattle breeder in Dori tells me that security for him, it's being able to get up in the morning, milk his cows, and take his animals to pasture, or take them to the market and sell them without any impediment. He's not just talking about the possibility for him to move around safely, but also to have peaceful, safe relationship with others, being in good terms with his neighbors, and having his cattle safe, because the cattle is everything for him. It's the source of his livelihood. It's the source of his pride in the village, right? So when we take security in that sense, we understand that billions of dollars investing in buying tanks and arms to deal with security issues is certainly necessary in some cases, but it's insufficient. And one clear evidence of that is that the international community and national governments in the Sahel have invested and keep investing billions of dollars to acquire weapons, but the security situation is just getting worse. Now, according to the Global Terrorism Index latest report, the Sahel has become the epicenter of global terrorism. In 2022, the number of terrorist incidents and fatalities recorded in the region have skyrocketed. And yet the military in Mali and in Burkina Faso, they grab power and they promise that they would do better than the civilian government. But what we realize is that things got worse.
There's excellent points. And I think we just have a couple of more minutes. I don't see any other hands. So I guess I will leave us with this question, which is, Matt, in your research, you found two communities that sort of were able to, in a sense, be more secure or avoided violence, avoided recruitment. And so I guess I would ask Patrick and Fong and Beza, are there examples at the local level that we could point to and say, you know, these are examples where there have been successful means at the local level of addressing these particular challenges? I appreciate very much getting that local perspective and understanding the impact of insecurity, the impact of climate change, and the perceptions about it. Is it sort of the next step incumbent upon us to see, okay, where are there models or programs or ways in addressing this that need to be understood, amplified, promoted, etc.?
I'm happy to jump in and build another project that Fong led on, but I speak more than she does, on what we call resilience for peace. And the idea for us was to look across different countries as to what factors bring people together, what assets, what resource do people have to avoid going into violence. And what I would propose from the presentation and what we heard from Mathieu is that what works in those communities in the Sahel may really not work somewhere else. And what we found is, for example, working in Timor and Guatemala, is the role of religious belief, for example, is very much a glue with some limitation, but was really important, fundamental to social cohesion in Timor in a way that it wasn't necessarily in Guatemala. And so rather than answering your question, if you don't mind, I would again use that to emphasize the fact that it is actually very, very much context specific, and we need to do these type of assessments that Mathieu and Beza are doing, this qualitative understanding of what works. But I will say maybe a couple of universal truths. One is we find that people want to know what happens, why it happened, and understand, this idea of how do we not make this happen again. And so the truth aspect to peace building is something that we found to be very, very important, core across culture. And yet in the example that I gave, it's not something that people measure. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Patrick. We're just about out of time. Final comments, answers, reflections from any of our panel? Well, let me just thank all of you for these, I must say, really stimulating and thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations. They really add to our thinking through what is effective peace building and how to frame these critical questions and finding ways to connect them. And so each of the presentations really brought an important sort of evidence-based perspective to our work overall on peace building. And so the nice thing from the Better Evidence Project is that we will continue to promote the work that all of you have done, and we'll continue to look forward to hearing all that you continue to do in your respective work and positions. So on behalf of all of the participants, thank you all very much for your presentations, and thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.